Studies Section 11. African Political Thought. Introduction. The African political thought aiming on individual political thinkers, activists, and starts with indigenous African political thought. In this study section, you will learn about the origin of modern African thought, negritude and African personality, and African socialism. Learning outcomes for study section 11. Discuss the origin of modern African thought, explain the negritude and African personality, examine the African socialism, origin of modern Africa. The 60s in Africa were a period that became well known for one form of political thought or the other. This was a period when most African countries became independent from their colonial masters, and as such they were proposing one form of political idea or the other which was against colonialism or which rejected the colonial ideology that justified colonialism. Before then, there were people of African origin in America who had rejected slavery, racism, as well as colonialism. People like Frederick Douglass, Alexander Crumen, and also Edward Blyden, and lastly, Du Bois. All these African Americans rejected slavery as an institution which is simply anti-human and which goes against the grain of liberal values, especially that of equality of human beings and liberty. There were also conferences that were held in Britain and other places before independence, especially in Manchester in 1945, which rejected the old colonialist ideology and called for the independence of the African people. These conferences were spearheaded by African American people of African origin living in America, especially and the Caribbean. From all these ideological writings came some ideologies like negritude and African personality. Negritude as an ideology was peculiar to Francophone African thinkers as well as Caribbean thinkers. It was mostly propagated by Leopold Sédar Senghor and M. Cissar. The whole idea of negritude is that the black race has certain characteristics that set them apart from the white race. The negritude movement became a rallying point for all Francophone thinkers in Africa and in France like Leo Damas, Alain Diop, and these people had a journal called Présence Africaine. The other ideological persuasion was African personality. It is not different from negritude. They were counter discourses to racist ideology and colonialism. What is of importance is that they were protest ideologies and they emphasized the humanity of the black race. These two ideologies became a veritable platform for what came to be African socialism. Dash is an ideology was peculiar to Francophone African thinkers as well as Caribbean thinkers. Negritude. Africa Socialist. African socialism was espoused by most African thinkers in the 60s. There were so many varieties of socialist thoughts in Africa, ranging from Nkrumah's conscientism to Nyerere's Njama, African Brotherhood, and Cabral's socialist thoughts, which is Marxist-oriented. What unites all these thinkers is that in African society, the community was revered and African societies were communal in nature. In Nkrumah's socialist thought, he believed that in African traditional society, what was most important was communalism. Nkrumah believed that before capitalism was introduced by colonial masters into African societies, what was practiced was something akin to socialism. He believed that there was the need to reinvent African socialism in modern-day Africa. Nkrumah claimed that there were three major traditions in Africa that have shaped the continent: traditional African thinking, Arabic thinking, and lastly European thinking. And what you need to do is to fuse these three sources together to get what he called conscientism, which will emphasize the African traditional thought or political system. Julius Nyerere's Njama is also along that line. He argues that in African traditional society, everybody was his brother's keeper. In other words, there was something like brotherhood. There was the communal behavior in everybody, and the community binds everybody together. Everybody was cared for in traditional African society. There was little gap between the rich and the poor. Hence, it was an egalitarian society and everybody was equal. Equality was the norm rather than exception. In all those African thinkers of the first wave of socialist generation who have emphasized African socialist thought claim that traditional African societies were socialistic in nature before the advent of colonialism. Dash and Dash are African socialists. Nyerere and Nkrumah, in addition to socialist ideas, have been in Africa before the advent of interventionism. At the turn of the 19th century, African socialisms mean numerous mergers of African thinkers, politicians, and activists interested with and reconfiguring of 19th and 20th century European socialist thought and practice. The basics are multiple, from trade unions and contacts with European workers to unite with European political parties, and through contacts with Pan-African, West India, and African American radicals. Most African thinkers and movements have known with many components of social democratic and Marxian forms of socialism, searching for to indigenize them to Africa. The upsurge of African socialisms as a movement corresponds with the early stages of nationalism and national development, the great point of which was the non-aligned movement and third worldism. African socialism as practice started with the first self-proclaimed socialist nationalist revolution in Africa, Gamal Abdel Nasser's 1918 to 1970. 1952 officers' coup in Egypt and intentional with globalization meeting South Africa's dissatisfied redistributive social democracy. All African socialisms shared corresponding structures that provide basis for nationalism and approaches to post-colonial development and nation building. First was a combination of state ownership and rightful distribution of wealth and increasing citizen welfare. Second was the sincerity of leading underdevelopment, of catching up. Third was providing important non-capitalist institutions that would form economic growth. And fourth was providing well-balanced social relationships of citizenship that could found union between people and the state. Proceeding to the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, socialist ideas and practices were made known to among sections of the African middle and working classes. The Sierra Leone Weekly News in 1913 connected union-based socialism in industrial Europe with the imaginary hallmark of an indigenous socialism, African hospitality, foreseen in opinions and myths then appealed by African socialist, nationalist, and political leaders. Striking laborers and clerks in Lagos in 1897 had neither socialist ideas nor organization to gather them against low-wage labor policy for Africans. Yet, African socialist movement stayed with the development of a current workforce. The first communist party in Africa and in the Arab world was fashioned in Egypt in 1921, where textile and transportation workers became the subject of communist attention after World War I. The common orientation of Egyptian Marxists and socialists was focused to the Arab world, which could continue into Nasserism. Egyptian communism stayed small, having a big influence upon intellectual Marxism, assessing many significant questions about socialism in a backward country. It had slight influence upon Egyptian policies and was incapable to progress a mass following among a large indigenous working class, a well-developed trade union tradition, and millions of Egyptian peasants or fellahin. The party finally separated in 1965 through infighting and Nasser's tyranny. Till the development of the 1970s Afro-Marxist regimes, movements promoting revolutionary Marxism were non-existent, and exclusion was one of the large cosmopolitan, European-controlled Algerian Communist Party made in 1936. By the 1950s, it had humiliated itself by continually placing the French benefits above Algerians. Two other exclusions were Sudan Communist Party and the South African Communist Party, SACP. In the early 21st century, the SACP remains mathematically strong, while the large Sudanese communist movement created in 1946 under the effect of Egyptian Marxists played a major role in the nationalist movement, holding important effect in Sudanese politics before General Gaffo Nimeri's brutal removals in the early 70s. Marxist inspiration would find homes within African socialism. Soviet and Chinese communism were standards of socialism through colonialism, nationalism, and the formative years of national growth. With few exceptions, like self-management in Algeria, 1960 to 1965, alternative or academic socialisms had little base in Africa. If Communist Party creation was forbidden during colonialism, many independence parties, especially in Francophone Africa, were displayed on communist parties. Many African leaders, even when seeing communism as intimidating, were impressed by the speed of its modernizing attainments through centralization, planning, and the one-party state. The Cold War also required locations on communism, most African states choosing charting unaligned vistas between it and Western capitalism. Cabral was a leader of the revolutionary movement in Guinea-Bissau. His own socialism is more thoroughly Marxist in nature. He does not believe in the African traditional system as you have it in both Nkrumah and Nyerere. His analysis of Guinea-Bissau's society follows that of Marxist thought, though with a little difference. He believes that colonialism has disrupted the historical evolution of African societies, and because of this, African societies have changed totally. He argues that you should jettison some traditional African values which are not helpful in our development, though some should be retained if they are helpful to our development. Dash was a leader of the revolutionary movement in Guinea-Bissau. A. Nkrumah, B. Nyerere, C. Cabral, D. Gaffo Nimeri, C. Cabral. Cabral's thinking is geared towards a socialist transformation of African societies. In Frantz Fanon, You have another thinker who has been influenced by many ideological orientations, though in the final analysis his thinking has more socialist element. He claims that colonialism was installed through violence, and it is through violence that colonialism could be overthrown by the colonized people. The violence involved cleanses the colonized people and as such restores their humanity. The main idea that runs through African American thinkers in diaspora and the Caribbeans is racism and the theme of slavery. In terms of African thinkers in the continent, the major idea that runs through their political thought is colonialism. The most colonial situation has thrown up another idea entirely because of the grim reality of autocratic rules in Africa. The political theory now is about such scenarios as the mismanagement of African continent and also corruption of African leaders. Besides, you have economic failures in most African countries. These grim realities have brought about another way of looking at Africa and have thrown up new political theories which grapple with these problems in Africa. In what sense, if any, could you say that African thought generally is a counter-discourse to the denigration of the black race? Summary for Studies Section 11. In this Studies Section 11, you have learnt that the origin of modern African thought is discussed and the African-American connection in relationship to this is examined. Negritude as an ideology was peculiar to Francophone African thinkers as well as Caribbean thinkers. It was mostly propagated by Leopold Sédar Senghor and Aimé Césaire. The whole idea of negritude is that the black race has certain characteristics that set them apart from the white race. The negritude movement became a rallying point for all Francophone thinkers in Africa, and in France, like Leo Damas, Aleno Diop, and these people had a journal called Présence Africaine. Negritude and African personality are explained. African socialism is discussed, and the three outstanding theorists of African socialism, Nkrumah, Nyerere, Cabral, are discussed. This is the end of Philosophy 305. Thanks for listening.